charts on the interest rate part, I had a dotted line for the price level. And you could see the interest rate moving up and down with the price level. That's why I said it's not Volcker, because Volcker moves you off that trend. But the trend itself comes from the price level. And the other thing that moves you off the trend is the bottom is the government suppression of the interest rate in the 1980s onward, going down well off that chart. The implication of my argument is that interest rates will move with prices because they depend on the cost of finance, cost of banking, and the profit rate. And those costs move obviously with the inflation, with the level of prices. So one of the implications is you can explain what is known in the literature as Gibson's paradox, the idea that interest rates move with prices. Marx refers to this, Tooke refers to this, Keynes refers to this, and it's called the paradox because the standard theory of the interest rate from neoclassical economics cannot make sense of it. And neoclassical economics is full of paradoxes. In finance, in trade, in growth, all of these are because the theory is inadequate. But we end up taking this inadequate theory without thinking about where it comes from, how it's derived. So I would argue that part of what we need to sweep away is the idea that the real rate of return is equal to the marginal product of capital, however that's stated. And that you need to think of the interest rate as a price. How do you get a real interest rate? You divide it by the price level. And like any other relative price, you get a relative price. If you look at that pattern over time, you'd be shocked to see how linear it is. I can explain that theoretically. However, this is why I'm not around very much, because I'm supposed to be writing this up for a book. So my apologies, but I have to run now. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. I'll just say very quickly, I mean, to Tom's question, we're starting to see some pretty serious capital outflows coming from, oh, is that better? coming from the U.S. Associated with the carry trade and the asset bubbles that are emerging in the most rapidly growing developing countries, and so the direction that a lot of speculative capital is flowing in is out of the U.S. That may be reversed if the mess that the U.S. economy is in results in interest rates rising in the foreseeable future, as I guess many of us expect they will. We may start to see the flows once again come back to the U.S. And so I'm thinking this rebalancing is not something that we have any reason to expect, but rather continued volatility in capital outflows going to developing countries and perhaps coming back to the U.S. In the foreseeable future.
Okay, just very quickly again, because I know Eileen has to leave as well. Laura, I think your question is very important. The way I would approach it is to note that this is a generic problem in social science. What does one mean to do, and what is one doing when one engages in comparisons of this kind? It's not tenable to say one may not compare Brazil and China. That cannot be the answer. So the answer has to be that there are certain conditions under which Brazil and China become suitable comparators. What are those conditions? The mere fact that the Brazilian debate on decoupling emphasizes, for example, some particular cause, an nominal exchange rate anchor as a way to tame inflation, which has no relevance in the Chinese case, doesn't mean that Brazil and China aren't in some structurally analogous position in the world economy. But we would have to take care in identifying what that is. So that's a merely methodological point. On the question about rebalancing the world economy, I suspect you had in mind the current account imbalances in particular, but you could have meant something else. Maybe I could have taken your question to mean that the financial sector, for example, had an overwhelming and disproportionate importance in advanced economies in recent years, and so the rebalancing that is called for then is a diminishing of the weight given to finance, insurance, real estate, and other related sectors, which have been at the core of the asset bubbles that have emerged. As you say, they may be related, and that's one of the theses about the causation of the crisis, but they may not be. Let me just provide, to close on this point, a parable which you all know well, which is that at the end of the Second World War in the Bretton Woods Conference, Britain and the United States had very complicated negotiations about the shape of the post-war system. And of course, it meant a lot more to Britain than the United States to achieve a certain kind of outcome, and in particular, to achieve the outcome in which the surplus countries would bear some of the burden of adjustment, and not only the deficit countries. The British wanted the Articles of Agreement of the IMF to enshrine such a requirement. In fact, they got a very watered-down clause, and the IMF never paid any attention to the role of surplus countries in the burden of adjustment until very recently, when it became a US concern. Of course, in the 1980s, with Japan-US imbalances becoming a significant issue, there was a bilateral negotiation about that question. And again, in the US-China relationship, there have been bilateral negotiations about that question. And today, the United States is behind the scenes pushing for the IMF to do exactly what Britain wanted the IMF to have as part of its mandate circa 1945, namely for the surplus countries to bear some of the burden of adjustment and not merely the deficit countries. So I think there's an enormous historical irony in this. I think the British case was right in the first place, that at least some of the burden should have been borne by the surplus countries. I think that remains right for a variety of reasons. But the reason can't simply be that the shoe is now on the other foot.
Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you to all our panelists for their time.